If you're looking to purchase a residential property here in my market of Surrey, BC, or if you're looking to sell, wouldn't it be nice to know what the actual contract looks like? I mean, before it's jammed in your face by some pushy agent, or before it ends up in your inbox and you digitally sign something that you had no idea or didn't understand whatsoever with just a few taps of your finger on your iPhone. Well, if your agent's not going to explain things in advance or in a way that you can understand, thankfully you found this channel dedicated to educating real estate consumers like yourself here in the province of BC. And if that's not worth a click of the like button, I don't know what is. So let's now jump into the contract of purchase and sale for residential properties here in the province of BC. All right, so here it is. This is the contract of purchase and sale residential as put out by the BCREA. So just so everybody understands, in a, I guess, spirit of cooperation and regulation, the BCREA, which is the Association of Realtors, puts out a standardized form of which can be altered. Some sections can be altered. Most should not be altered, actually, because it is the fairest and best way to avoid problems for buyers and sellers and realtors and everybody involved. So there will be many, many pages we'll go over. Your real estate contract could be a lot longer, but this is about as short as it should be. And I'll kind of explain here the first 2 pages. So this entire first page and the entire second page are explanations only. They are not part of the contract. However, they do and should need to be shown to you, the buyer or the seller. Now, it's tradition that in order to cover our butts in the real estate industry, we would want you, if you were our buyer, to understand costs that may come to you. So we're likely going to have you initial here. Or if you're the seller, we're going to have your initials beside those costs that may come to you as well. But it is not part of the contract. It's only an acknowledgement. The actual contract starts actually on the 3rd page of the contract, or becomes page 1 of 9, 9 being the minimum amount that you should see currently as of making this video, pages within the contract itself. Now I'm going to really break this down for you. Your brokerage, that needs to be the brokerage that is preparing the contract. So that's going to be the buyer's brokerage. The date they prepared the contract, the address of the brokerage is always important, and which agent is actually preparing the offer and for which property or MLS number. Now the buyer's names will be listed. There's now 3 slots for buyer's names. Usually there's 1 or 2. Quite often we'll see 4 or more. So there is enough space. Same for the sellers as well. Now my experience shows me that most agents are too lazy to put their buyer's address in and the seller's address in, believe it or not. Now, the seller's address may be different than the property they are selling. Most often they are the same because most transactions are done for homeowners. However, it would not be uncommon to see addresses blank, which I think is a little lazy, but it happens almost all of the time. Next, we're going to move down and look at the actual property. So the property is identified in a few different ways. There's going to be the residential address of the property, which is the one that you would mail, the mailing address, let's call it. Then you're going to have a PID, a property identifier number. It's, I believe, what is it, a 9-digit number, something like that. And it's going to be on this line here. There is possibility that there will be more than one PID connected to a property, but generally speaking, you're only going to have one. And then you're going to have the legal description that will be noted here as per land title. So there's a good reason for this. So we have a mailing address so we can find the property, legal address, so as known, as I said, by the land title office, and then the PID. So those are all going to be cross-referenced to make sure you're selling the correct property, and hopefully at least 2 or 1 or 2 out of 3 are correct. Hopefully all 3 are correct, and that way we can kind of cross-reference to make sure we have the right place. Now, next up is purchase price. Purchase price should be written 2 different ways. So ideally we want to write in the numbers. So if it's $1 million, 1,000,000,000. And then you also need to write it out in words. So you want to see the words $1 million. So those should be done both ways. Again, this is for clarification. So somebody's not like, oh, is that a 0 or a 6? and nobody can try and pull some funny business. So the price has to be written out two different ways. The next section here is for the home buyer rescission period, or what they call a cooling off period. That's going to be a calculation of the purchase price at, I believe it's whatever 0.25% of the purchase price. So as a result, you'll see every time a buyer and seller agree or counter an offer, you'll see a corresponding number, an equation with the buyer rescission fee. Now, the buyer rescission fee is very misunderstood. The buyer rescission fee applies if the buyer walks away for any reason within the first 3 business days. However, that's only if they walk away with rescission and not if they walk away for, if they have conditions or something in the contract. So it's going to be written in every single contract. Really, it only actually comes into play if the market is hot and buyers are writing unconditional offers. Really silly, not very well thought out when it was brought in by the government, but what is well thought out by the government? Then you're going to have buyers and sellers initial on the bottom of every single page. You're going to see that repeat as we go down. Next up on page 2, we're going to have a deposit amount. Now, the deposit amount here in BC is very commonly around 5% of the purchase price. If the closing's, 60 to 90, maybe 120 days. If you go past that, you're going to want to see larger deposits. And if you have a very quick close, you could maybe get away with a little smaller deposit. But as a rule of thumb, shoot for 5%. And that is payable within 24 hours of acceptance, unless agreed to otherwise. And most commonly, you will agree to it otherwise. Here in BC, particularly here in the Lower Mainland, it's most common. This will be different in other parts of BC for sure, but it's most common that the deposit will not be paid until the deal is firm, meaning subjects are removed. And the reason for that is it's really hard sometimes to get money out of trust. So as a result, let's not put it in trust until buyer and seller fully agree upon everything and the property is technically sold. Usually that's done by bank draft, and those terms would be clarified in those couple of lines. And then next up is who is going to hold the deposit. Now, the deposit is generally, again, traditionally, doesn't have to be this way, but traditionally the buyer's brokerage will hold that money in trust as a bit of a stakeholder. But it does have to be at some point in trust, I believe by law. It says right here, the Real Estate Services Act, it's going to be held by one of those brokers. And if it's held by somebody other than a real estate broker, there's another form that needs to come around. So the reason is you don't want to necessarily give the money directly to the seller, because if they don't complete as the buyer, you could be in trouble. There may be benefits to doing that. You may get a better deal if you give them cash now. However, there's a whole lot more paperwork that needs to come along with it. Oh, and I forgot to mention that if all of this is a little bit overwhelming and you think you need some help, you can book a call with me right now using the first link in the description below this video. And it's important to note here that if you're already working with an agent, sorry, I can't help. I'm a licensee. I can't get involved in another transaction. And you should then rely on the advice that's being provided to you by the agent that you hired in order to get the job done. Now, the next most important part is the terms and conditions. Now, this part where it comes and says 3 terms and conditions, it can be very long because this section is blank here because this is the part where your agent is going to have discussions with you about the terms and conditions that you want to offer, and also as the seller about what they want to counter offer with. This is the section that is most important because your agent, if you're a buyer, is writing these conditions, and if you're a seller, this is likely where the conditions are coming in, where your agent has to review to make sure they understand what it is you're signing. This is where you're going to have your conditions to what we call subject to financing, inspection, all of those things. Now, when I write a contract, I'll have 4 or 5 or 6 pages of terms and conditions, something that is way too much to explain here in this video, but let's say anything from subject to financing to how the property condition will be left to making sure that the buyer and seller both know their tax implications. Absolutely everything you can think of when it comes to not just the fine print, of which you'll see lots of it here, but the specifics of what the buyer and seller need to do within the contract. That's not, I guess, what you would call standardized. And I mean standardized by this form being standardized by the BCREA. Now, again, this could and should probably extend for 3, 4, 5, 6 pages. So chances are 3 of 9 will not be the dates page, but for sake of this, let's keep going. Now, this is the fun part with completion. So everybody focuses on price. It's at the beginning. But realistically, completion, possession, and adjustment dates are very important. Completion is the date the money changes hands for the property. Possession is the day you get the keys. Here in BC, they are separately negotiated. They could be the same day. They could be, I've done them 30 days apart in the past. So they can be a tool to use to make sure everybody can move comfortably. They can be a tool to be used to make sure somebody that's been in a home for a long time has the ability to move on, or if you want early possession on one property and not the one you're selling, but the one you're buying. So they can all be negotiated fairly and for the benefit of ease of all. There is also going to be a time, not just a date, but also a specific time of when you will get the keys. Often the keys will maybe happen even before that, but they cannot happen after. The adjustment dates is interesting because the adjustment dates are usually the same as the possession, and that's when things like property taxes get adjusted for. So for instance, if you have completion on a Wednesday, but you don't get your keys till Saturday, that's fine, but I'm not going to pay my property taxes for that portion. The old owner is. So that's what the adjustment date would be for. Next up is included items, and this is exactly what you would think it would be. Appliances and absolutely everything you can think of that you want in the home if you're the buyer. But realistically, this is only what you're asking for, and it's not guaranteed. And you should consider this one thing. Included items should include what we call chattels. Chattels are not affixed to the property. So you'll notice here it says all of the attachments should be there anyway. Things like awnings, screen doors, windows, curtain rods, tracks, valances, fixed mirrors, carpeting, electrical, like all the stuff that you know is connected. But something like, for instance, let's say refrigerator is under its own weight. It can be unplugged and removed. So it needs to be included here. It is not standard that appliances or anything else comes with the property. So you have to have them written in here. And if you don't, let's just say many times I have had agents forget to write in appliances, and well, then legally we could sell the appliances off separate from the home. So it must be included. Now, this becomes very, I guess, confusing when it comes to things like televisions that are now mounted to walls. So a TV is mounted to the wall. Technically, the bracket probably stays. The TV is hung on the bracket. So because it's hung, it doesn't stay. You can see where you're going to want to clarify. And also, if there's anything you want excluded as a buyer or a seller, say for instance, your grandmother gave you her old antique chandelier in the dining table. Well, you can't take that because it says up here that things like electrical and plumbing and heating should all be included. So if you're going to remove something that's affixed, and affixed means like if we need a tool, let's say, to remove it, generally speaking, you have to exclude it here in this section because number 8, the buyer wants the property in substantially the same condition as when they viewed the property, and we're going to say what date that was. So there's no swapping out of appliances or changing, and it's like there's horror stories out there. I've seen it all. I've seen properties change. I've seen people paint. I've seen people remove electric thermostats or video cameras. So it has to be very clear on what is included and what is not. Now, thank goodness for standardized forms, because we're going to deal with all sorts of stuff like the title and the particulars of residency and everything you can think of that is probably more than you're going to think of is all covered by the BCREA standardized forms. For instance, time being of the essence, buyer financing, clearing title, cost, risk. There's so much here that as agents, we're not going to type up every single time because it's going to be very standardized and not particular to the property, but more to have to do with the conveyance of the title. So all of that legalese is here, and there's a lot of it. One of those very important standardized things now, thank you, Christy Clark, before you left office, is the assignment of remuneration, the restrictions of assignment on contract. We see this crossed out all the time. So let me give you a little bit of background here. If you see the assignment clause here crossed out, that's because all contracts are assignable by law. However, in 2016, The news reported on something called shadow flipping, which is just assignment of contract in legalese, and it was demonized, I guess you would call it, and as a result, you can no longer assign contracts in BC, but it's not that you can't assign them, it's that I can't write a contract without the restriction of the assignment. I know it gets very complicated, but a buyer can then opt out. So without this crossed out, the buyer could not assign the contract. Say, for instance, if you're a wife signing on behalf of you and your husband at the time, so you're only putting the contract in one name. If you wanted to add your husband later on, you would not be able to do so unless this was crossed out. And the other side of it is, if you are flipping a property, any profit will go to the original seller. Again, unless this is crossed out. So it gets very, very confusing. If you see this crossed out, all the sellers, their backs get up and they're very worried that somebody's going to make a bunch of money or that they're underselling the property. Generally speaking, that's not the case. Chances of a flip, particularly in this market right now, are very slim. So don't stress out about this, but definitely understand and ask questions from your agent about why they're crossing out 20A, which is extremely I don't even know if I want to call it important. I just want to call it a bone of contention when we're negotiating offers. Then you're going to sign off an initial if you're the seller, who your agent is, if you're the buyer, who your agent is, or if you are unrepresented, that you have received things like dual agency, which it's funny that they have dual agency here at all because, I mean, we're not allowed to do dual agency. Technically, legally, we are, but you have to ask for permission for it to be granted, and 0 have ever been granted, so that's funny. Or if you're completely unrepresented, if you're silly enough to not use an agent, you have to sign off on those things as well. Now, this is comical to me. 22. Acceptance is irrevocable. So what this is saying is if you accept the offer, you cannot back out of the offer other than the conditions that are in it. So if the buyer has a financing condition, they can back out if they don't get their financing, but the seller cannot back out. Except for the fact that acceptance is irrevocable due particularly to the buyer and them having the ability to have the cooling off period, rescission period. So is that really revoking? No, it's cooling off rescission, but anyway, it's real legalese. It's really silly, but really we want the seller to sign off to say that, listen, if you are accepting this offer as is, chances are the conditions are for the buyer and not for the seller. So there's no backing out for you later on, unless of course you do have some sort of a seller's subject, which is possible. Then there's even more talk about the buyer rescission period, which is quite silly. The buyer and seller are going to initial off that they understand fully the rescission period, which I guarantee you likely will not. Then I think this is kind of foolish, but there is a big blank page left below. I mean, it is kind of nice that there is a big blank page here left below in case there needs to be any notes and there wasn't room left above. But it is kind of silly that it is sitting there blank. Now, if you're looking at this contract from like an area in Ontario where they have an irrevocable clause, it's kind of the same thing, but a little bit different. If you're going to write an offer, you're going to write it open until a certain time and date. So my offer is valid until tomorrow night at 7 p.m. However, it's only important, that number right now is only important, I guess, from a legal point of view, if everyone is accepted. So let's say, for instance, my offer is open to you 7 o'clock tomorrow night. However, you counter offer me at 8 o'clock. You can just change the date and time on there, counter it back to me, and we can still agree. But you can't accept it past 7 o'clock. Otherwise, technically, it's a counter offer. So again, legalese, you're going to want to make sure if you ever go past a date and time within the contract, you should really scrap the contract after it's been accepted. While you're still negotiating, you can go back and forth, but realistically, finally, that everything should be initialed off prior to whatever is written here in 26 and fully accepted. Then the buyers and sellers are going to sign off that either yes or no, they are a resident of Canada for tax purposes. Extremely important. As I say, the buyer is going to sign off here and initial. The seller is going to do the same below if they are a resident or not. Now, if you are a buyer, you might think, I don't really care if the seller is a foreigner or not. You do. Because if they skip out on their capital gains bill, you will get stuck with it eventually. And of course, if in most cases right now you're a buyer and not a resident for tax purposes, you are probably not allowed to purchase. Now, there is something clarified here. This is in the most recent version of the form. It's now called the final acceptance time. This is very strange. There used to be an acceptance time, of which would be the time that the seller first counters a buyer or accepts, and then a final acceptance time, which is when everybody finally agrees to the, like, it was really confusing. So thankfully they've removed that. Now we only have the final acceptance time. The only problem with that is a lot of agents forget to fill it out unless they are the seller. So the buyer could end up actually being the person to finally accept the deal, and then the buyer's agent forgets to fill out this date. So it's very important that once everybody has fully agreed to everything, that's when the final acceptance kicks in. And the reason the final acceptance kicks in is because it's extremely important to calculate the buyer rescission period, of which, again, likely doesn't apply. I know it's all very stupid, but where the rescission could get delivered if the buyer does want to back out for a fee, the address of such, the email of such. And let me really get into the weeds with you about this. This is actually technically outside of the contract and outside of the brokerages, between the buyer and the seller directly. So if you actually, as a seller, want to collect that fee from a buyer, good luck, because your agents can't help you do it. It's really stupid unless they've paid the deposit. However, we need to now calculate 3 business days. So I'm recording this on a Wednesday. So let's say, for instance, our final acceptance day was today, and we're going through a regular weekend without a long weekend. The buyer rescission period would start on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday don't count. And then Monday, if it's not a holiday, they have until 11:59 p.m. on that Monday to rescind their offer. So they actually end up with 5 days, 6 if it's a long weekend, or if there's any other bank holidays or anything involved within that time. So you're going to want to make sure that the buyer rescission date is correct, even though it probably does not apply. And of course, at the bottom of every page, you're going to see that the buyer and seller need to sign off an initial, because you want proof that they've seen each and every page. Now, I do want you to also understand that a new offer does not need written every single time. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to complete on the 31st of the month, and the seller says, well, sorry, that doesn't work. I want to complete on the 27th. What happens is the 31st gets crossed out, the 27th gets written in, and now both the buyer and seller have to initial that change. And that happens with every little tiny thing, minor counter and change. And if every little detail is not initialed by each party, you technically do not have final acceptance and you do not have an offer. So you should never, if you hear from your agent something like, oh, it's all accepted, we just need your initials, that means it's not accepted. And it should be accepted if you want to accept it, or if you want to counter it in a very timely manner. Now, do expect that if you are writing offers, I'm going to show you down on close to the last page, this offer open date up on, it's going to happen very quickly. So again, if I'm recording this in the morning, 10:30 in the morning, if I received an offer right now, we're going to respond to that offer today, and probably not only respond to that offer today, they're probably going to put something like 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock at night. So we're going to get to it very, very quickly. It's not like you're going to receive an offer for the most part, and you're going to get it today, and then you're going to have 4 or 5 days to respond, or even 24 hours to respond. Most of the time, buyers want to know if they can lock up the property. Otherwise, they're going to move on to other properties of which the person is ready, willing, and able to negotiate. And if you made it this far, you should probably watch this video next that explains a form that could actually be more important than the real estate contract itself.